She counts the candles. Sabine, I have a wife who counts the candles in her own drawing room and writes the number down, and I am expected to admire her for it. The voice came from under a black wolf mask at the punch table at the Marchioness of Ilbury's Masquerade, and it belonged to Julian, Duke of Ashcombe. The woman on his arm laughed the low, practised laugh of a woman who has decided to be delighted by everything a rich man says, and an arm's length to his left, close enough to have touched his sleeve, stood a woman in a grey silk mask cut in the shape of a moth's wings, holding a glass of ratafia she had not tasted, listening to her husband describe her to his mistress as one might describe a stain on a carpet. Nobody in that room knew who she was. That was the whole point of the evening, and it was about to become the whole point of the next 12 months. If you have ever sat quietly in a room while people who believed you could not hear them told the truth about how little they thought of you, then you already know what the next few minutes did to Eleanor. Duchess of Ashcombe. You know the peculiar cold that goes down the back of the neck. You know the strange politeness of the body which keeps holding the glass level while everything underneath it is being taken apart. Before we go on, do me a favour. Tap subscribe, because these stories go up several times a week, and I would like you here for the ending of this one. Hit the like button if you believe a woman's silence should never be mistaken for her consent. And tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight, because I genuinely love reading how far these stories travel. Now, what the Duke of Ashcombe did not know, behind his wolf mask, was that he was not being overheard by a stranger. He was being interviewed, and by the time the candles guttered in the Ilbury ballroom, he would have handed a masked woman the name of his man of business, the size of a debt he had no business owing, the date of a deed he had signed in secret, and a promise concerning a sapphire that had belonged to that masked woman's dead mother. He would spend a year wondering who she was. She would tell him herself, eventually in front of 200 people in the same room in her own voice. To understand how a woman comes to stand beside her husband while he takes her reputation apart for sport, we have to go back 9 years to a marriage that was never a romance and had never pretended to be. Eleanor Marchmont was 22 when she was made a Duchess, and she had known the price of everything since she was old enough to read a bill of lading. Her father, Josiah Marchmont, owned 9 ships out of Bristol and a share in a rope works, and he had money the way a river has water, steadily and without ceremony. What he did not have was a name that would open the door of a London drawing room. The Duke of Ashcombe had the opposite problem. He had a name 400 years old, a house with 106 rooms, a fen estate in Norfolk that flooded every spring, and debts that had been politely accumulating since his father's time like snow on a roof. The arrangement was made in a solicitor's office in Bristol and took 40 minutes. £80,000 settled on the marriage, 20 of it tied into a marriage settlement that remained hers and hers alone, administered by trustees, protected by law from any duke who might get careless with a card table. Josiah Marchmont insisted on that clause the way a man insists on a lifeboat. He is not a bad man, her father told her the night before the wedding, and she noticed that he did not say a good one. Julian was handsome in the way that costs nothing and is therefore never valued by its owner. He was pleasant at the wedding, charming at the breakfast, attentive for a season and a half. And then the novelty wore through the way lacquer wears off a cheap tray, and by the second winter he was polite at breakfast and absent by supper, and by the third he was not always polite at breakfast. Ashcombe itself was cold. Not metaphorically. Actually cold, an enormous grey house set in a park where the wind came off the sea, over 11 miles of flat land, and found every gap in every sash. Half of it was shut. When Eleanor arrived as a bride, she was shown the state rooms with pride, and the accounts not at all. She found the accounts herself in the second year in a japanned box in the steward's room, and what she found there kept her awake for 3 nights. The Ashcombe estate was not poor, it was mismanaged. Rents were being collected at rates set in 1770. 200 acres of good fen were under water for 4 months of the year, because a drainage sluice at Mile End had been broken since before Julian was born, and repairing it had been an item on a list for 11 consecutive years. The timber accounts had not been reconciled since the old Duke died. Somebody was buying candles at a price that would have made her father laugh out loud and then dismiss the man who signed for them. So she began, quietly, without announcement. She went through the ledgers with a pencil. She wrote to the tenants, all 41 of them, and then she visited them, and she sat in their kitchens and drank tea she did not want, and asked what they needed. She renegotiated the timber contract. She replaced the coal merchant. Within 4 years, the Ashcombe rent roll had risen by nearly a third. The fen tenants at Mile End were farming through the spring for the first time in living memory, and the house accounts were showing a surplus for the first time since the Regency. Her husband never asked how. Once, at dinner, a neighbour complimented him on the improvements at Mile End, and Julian accepted the compliment without a flicker, and said something about having taken the estate in hand, and Eleanor cut her mutton and said nothing at all. That was the year she learned the lesson that most of the women watching this will recognise. She had offered him an opinion once about the fen leases at a dinner in front of guests. It had been a good opinion. But that night he had looked at her down the table with an expression of faint embarrassment, the way a man looks at a dog that has come into the dining room, and afterwards he had said, "In the corridor you might leave the business to those who understand it, Eleanor. It looks grasping." She did not argue. She did not cry. She simply understood with great clarity that in that house she would be permitted to be useful but never to be visible, and she made a decision that she would keep for 6 more years. She learned not to offer her opinion. Instead, she wrote it down. She kept her own set of books in a plain marbled cover in the bottom drawer of her writing desk in the morning room, and in them she recorded what the estate earned, and what it spent, and what she had recommended, and what had been done instead. She did not think of it as a weapon. She did not think of it as anything at all. It would eventually put a man on a convict ship. The servants knew what she was, even when her husband did not. Mrs. Dunning, the housekeeper, who had come to Ashcombe as a girl of 14 and had watched 3 duchesses, formed her verdict in the first winter and never altered it. "Her Grace has the only head in the house," she told the cook, "and the only one nobody asks." The tenants knew. The Bristol clerks who handled her private settlement knew, because she read every quarterly statement line by line, and once caught an error of £11, and wrote about it so courteously that the clerk in question, a young man called Pell, remembered her for the rest of his career. Her husband, meanwhile, was in London. He was in London a great deal by the 6th year. Business, he said. The Lords, he said. He kept a house in Grosvenor Street, and a box at the Opera, and a tailor who was owed £400, and he came down to Ashcombe for the shooting and at Christmas, and when he wanted money. She did not follow him. She was not asked to. When she did come to town twice a year, she found the Grosvenor Street house arranged around a man who was rarely in it, with a footman who could not quite meet her eye, and a smell in the small drawing-room that was not hers. Bergamot and orange flower. She noticed it the first time and said nothing. She noticed it the second time on the shoulder of his coat when he leaned past her to take the salt, and she looked at the candles on the table and counted them, because counting is what she did with her hands when the rest of her had to be held very still. 8 candles. She wrote it down later, in the plain marbled book, in the back, where the notes were 14 November. Bergamot, Grosvenor Street. She did not yet know the name that went with the scent. She would learn it 3 weeks after that, and once she had it, everything that had been vague became specific, and everything that had been sad became, in her own words, a matter of record. Her name was Mrs. Sabine Varell, and she was very good at what she did. She was the widow of a company man who had died in Madras, leaving her a decent income, an excellent wardrobe and no protection whatsoever, and she had spent the 7 years since converting charm into security with the unsentimental efficiency of a woman who has done the sums. She was 31. She had a wide, warm, generous face and a laugh that made strangers feel clever. A woman who had known her in Bath put it best. Years later, in a letter Eleanor kept, Sabine never says the unkind thing. She only leaves the pause where it would go. She had taken up with the Duke of Ashcombe at a card party in the spring, and by midsummer she was installed in a set of rooms on Half Moon Street with a lease in his name. And by autumn she had stopped bothering to pretend to her friends that it was anything but permanent. She did not love him. She said so, in company, to a friend who repeated it. "I want him for having, not for keeping," Sabine said. "Keeping is a poor return. Having is where the money is." The first thing that left Ashcombe was money. It always is. In the January, Eleanor noticed that the quarterly transfer from the estate account had been drawn a fortnight early and short by £400, and that the deficit had been made up out of the timber money. In the February, she found a draft made payable to a name she did not recognise, endorsed twice. In the March, there were 3 such drafts, and by midsummer the pattern had a shape she could have drawn with a ruler, sums leaving Ashcombe by way of the estate account, passing through the hands of one Silas Kemble, and arriving nowhere she could see. Silas Kemble had been engaged as the Duke's man of business 2 years earlier, on someone's recommendation, and Eleanor had disliked him from the first quarter hour. He was a soft, deferential, close-shaved man of about 40, who called her Your Grace with an extra syllable of respect each time, and who answered every question she asked with a great deal of language and no information whatsoever. He had a way of gathering papers toward himself when she entered a room. By the 7th year, Kemble held the Ashcombe rent books, the lease negotiations, the London accounts, and the Duke's power of attorney over estate business, which the Duke had signed on a Tuesday afternoon, she later established without reading it, because he was going to Newmarket on the Wednesday. The second thing that left Ashcombe was not money, and it hurt in a different place. In the August, Mrs. Dunning came to the morning room, shut the door, and stood with her hands folded in front of her apron in the manner of a woman who has decided to say a thing whatever it costs her. "The Gerard silver has gone up to town, your grace. 12 covers, the pern and the salvers. Mr. Kemble's order over his grace's signature for the Grosvenor Street house." Eleanor said, "Thank you, Mrs. Dunning," and went on writing for a moment, because her hand had to finish the line it was on. The Gerard silver was Ashcombe silver. That was bearable. What was not bearable arrived in October in the form of a note from a Bristol acquaintance who wrote, with the awful kindness of a woman who thinks you would rather know, that the table had been laid with plate bearing the Ashcombe crest, and that Mrs. Verrell had made a charming little joke about it. She said the letter reported that the crest was a great convenience, since it saved her the trouble of having her own engraved. Eleanor read that sentence 4 times. Then she put the letter in the bottom drawer, in the marbled book, at the back, and wrote the date beside it. This was the point at which the thing stopped being a private grief. A husband who keeps a mistress is a wound to a marriage. A husband who allows his mistress to dine off the estate's plate, paid for out of rents raised by his wife's work, collected from tenants his wife has visited in their kitchens, is something else entirely. That is not a broken heart. That is theft. And still she did nothing, and I want to be honest with you about why. Because it matters. It was not weakness. It was arithmetic. She had a suspicion, a smell of bergamot, a housekeeper's report, and a gossiping letter from Bristol. A woman who accuses a duke on that evidence loses. She loses the servants, who will be dismissed for talking. She loses the tenants, because a scandal at the great house means agents and lawyers and rent rises. And she loses the only advantage she has ever possessed in that house, which is that nobody thinks she is paying attention. Accusation without proof is a gift to a guilty man. So she waited, and she copied, and she wrote to Pell at Fenner's Bank about a small matter of a draft, and she let the winter come. The Masquerade was the Dowager's idea. Augusta, Dowager Duchess of Ashcombe, was 71 years old, 5 feet tall, and universally feared. She had not much liked Eleanor at first, on the grounds that she had not much liked the necessity of Bristol money, and she had spent the first 4 years addressing her daughter-in-law with a chilly courtesy that could have preserved meat. Then, in the 5th year, she had gone down to Mile End in her own carriage to see what all the noise was about, and had come back and said to nobody, "Well, the girl has drained the fen." After that they took tea together every Thursday when they were both in the county, and the Dowager said nothing warm and nothing unkind, and would have gone through fire for her. "You will come to Ilbury's Masquerade," Augusta said, in the February, in London. "You have been in the country since Michaelmas like a widow, and my son has been in town like a bachelor, and half the room has begun to enjoy that arrangement rather more than I care for. I am not fond of masquerades. Nobody is fond of masquerades. That is why one goes masked." The old woman set down her cup. "Julian has told me you are unwell and cannot come, and I have told 6 people that you are perfectly well, and I do not intend to be made a liar in my own club. Wear something nobody expects, let them wonder." So a domino was ordered, in dove grey, and with it a mask that Eleanor chose herself from a tray at a shop in Cranbourne Alley, not a black half-mask like everyone else's, not a cat, not a shepherdess, a moth. Grey silk stretched over a wire frame, the wings swept back over the cheekbones, silver thread along the edges, a thing that swallowed the whole upper half of the face and made the wearer into a shape rather than a person. The shopwoman said it was an odd choice, since most ladies wanted the butterfly. "The butterfly is looked at," Eleanor said. "I would rather see." She would remember saying that. She would remember it for the rest of her life, and so, in a way, would her husband. Ilbury House on the night of the 11th of March held something over 200 people, and not one of them was officially present. That is the convention of a masquerade, and it is the reason the 18th century invented them, and the 19th kept them going long past decency. Everyone is masked, therefore everyone is a stranger. Therefore, everyone may behave as though the consequences belong to somebody else. There were 3 harlequins, a Cleopatra with a real asp made of enamel, and a great many gentlemen in ordinary evening dress with a scrap of silk across the eyes, which is what gentlemen wear when they wish to have it both ways. Eleanor came in with the dowager at 10:30 and lost her within 4 minutes, which was by arrangement. Augusta went to the card-room to be formidable at whist. Eleanor took a glass of ratafia she did not intend to drink and walked the length of the ballroom and discovered something that she had not expected and that would stay with her. Nobody spoke to her. Nobody looked at her twice. In a grey domino and a grey moth mask. A woman of ordinary height with her hair dressed plainly, she was less than anonymous. She was scenery. And she found that she liked it. It was the first hour in 9 years in which nothing was expected of her by anyone. She was standing near the second window beside a stand of forced hyacinths, listening to an old gentleman explain the corn laws to a woman dressed as a swan. When she heard her husband laugh, she would have known that laugh through a wall. It came from behind her from the refreshment table, and she did not turn around, because a woman who does not turn around is not eavesdropping, she is merely standing where she already was. He was in a black wolf mask with the ears worked in silver wire, and he had not troubled to change his coat, his boots, his rings, his height, his voice, or the particular way he stood with his weight on his left leg. He believed himself concealed. Men of his kind generally do. The woman with him wore scarlet and gold and a half mask stitched with sequins, and she smelled of bergamot and orange flower. Eleanor moved 1 step to her left, which put her beside the hyacinths, half turned away, close enough to hear, near enough to be part of the furniture. She held her glass level. She listened. They talked about the room first, about who was obviously who, about the Cleopatra's asp, and Sabine Varel was funny about all of it in that easy, generous, poisonous way she had. Then the Duke said something about coming down to Ashcombe at Easter and being a dutiful husband for a fortnight, and Sabine made a small noise of protest and said, "Poor creature. Does she like the country, or does she merely fit it?" And the Duke of Ashcombe, in a room full of people he could not identify, said this, "She fits it." My God, Sabine, you cannot imagine the fit. She has a face like a Sunday afternoon. Not ugly. Nothing so interesting as ugly. She is what you get when you take a perfectly good countenance and remove from it every trace of anything at all. Sabine laughed. Eleanor watched the hyacinths. She counts the candles. He went on, warming to it, the way a man warms when a woman is laughing and there is punch in his hand and a mask on his face. She counts the candles, Sabine. I have a wife who counts the candles in her own drawing room and writes the number down, and I am expected to admire her for it. She writes everything down: tallow, sacking, the price of pigs. She goes into the tenants' kitchens and drinks their tea. She once told me at dinner, in front of the Fanshaws, what she thought about a lease. How did you bear it? With difficulty. It is the money, you know. You can dress it and title it and drive it about in a coronet coach, but you cannot get the counting house out of it. She smells of Bristol. He drank. Her father sold rope. And she has no notion? Sabine said. Truly? None? None. She has never asked me a question in 9 years that was not about a chimney. A pause. Eleanor heard the ice move in the punch bowl. She suspects nothing. She forgives everything, and if she ever found out, she would weep for one evening and be at the breakfast table the next morning, asking whether I had slept well. She has nowhere else to be. That is the beauty of a wife like mine, Sabine. She is not kept. She is simply parked. There is a moment, if this has ever happened to you, that you will recognize. It is not the moment of pain. It is the moment just before, when your body understands and your mind has not quite caught up, and everything in the room becomes very sharp and very slightly too loud. Eleanor Marchmont stood in her grey moth mask beside a stand of hyacinths, and she did not move. She did not gasp. Her glass did not shake, because she was holding it in a hand that had counted £11 of error in a bank statement and had never once shaken at anything. And then she did a thing that she could not entirely explain afterwards, except that some part of her, the part that reads a column of figures and knows which one is the lie, had already begun to work. She turned around, and she joined the conversation. Forgive me, she said. Her voice, behind a mask in a room of 200, was simply a woman's voice, pitched low, without Bristol in it, because she had spent 9 years having Bristol trained out of her by a woman in Bath who charged 4 guineas a quarter. The hyacinths are overpowering. I have been standing in them like a fool. The Duke turned, saw a grey domino and a silver moth, and made the small, courteous inclination that men make to unknown women at masquerades, which contains a question. You were speaking of wives, Eleanor said. It is the only interesting subject in the room. May a stranger be impertinent? At a masquerade, said Sabine warmly, a stranger has no other function. Then tell me this. She turned her masked face to the Duke, and later she would say that this was the strangest sensation of her life, looking directly at her husband through a wire frame and watching him look back at a woman he did not know and instantly like better than the one he had. Such a wife is an expensive habit to keep parked. Do you not find the arrangement costly? He laughed. Delighted, a masked woman with a dry voice, asking about money, at a party on a March night, and Julian, Duke of Ashcombe, who had never in his life been able to resist appearing knowing, said not in the least. It is a great deal cheaper than you imagine. My man has the whole of it in hand. Your man. Kemble? There is not a cleverer fellow in England with a lease. He has arranged the fen business so neatly that the estate pays for its own pleasures and thanks him for it. He tapped the side of his mask in the manner of a man being roguish. There is a deed of some £4,000 signed on the 2nd of this month that I promise you no living soul will ever ask me about. Julian, said Sabine, in a tone that was not quite amused. She is a mask, my dear. Tomorrow she is nobody. "And the sapphire," Sabine said, and the change in her voice was the change of a woman moving to the only part of the conversation she has been waiting for. "You promised me the sapphire in March, and it is the 11th. You shall have it at Easter, when I am down there being dutiful. It sits in a bank in Bristol doing nothing whatever except being sentimental." Eleanor said, "A family piece?" "Her mother's," said the Duke of Ashcombe cheerfully to his wife. "Dead these 15 years. She takes it out at Christmas. She will not miss it above a week." And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the sentence. Everything else that night had been contempt, and contempt can be survived. That sentence was not contempt. That sentence was a plan to take a dead woman's ring off her daughter's hand and put it on the hand of a woman who had just called her a poor creature, and to do it while the daughter poured his tea. Eleanor said, "How fortunate for you both. Good evening." And she walked away. She did not unmask. Think about that, because it is the hinge on which this entire story turns, and it is the reason we are still telling it. She could have. She could have lifted the grey moth off her face at that punch table, and there would have been a silence in that corner of Ilbury House that people would have described at dinner tables for a decade. She would have had the pleasure of watching a man's face come apart. She would have had, in exchange for that pleasure, exactly one thing: a warned enemy. An unmasking buys you one night. A mask buys you a year. Behind that grey silk she had already begun to count what she now possessed. She had a name, Kemble. She had a date, the 2nd of March. She had a figure, £4,000. She had a deed she was not supposed to know existed, an intention regarding a sapphire in a Bristol vault, and the knowledge that the fen business, her fen, the 200 acres she had drained with her own arithmetic, had been arranged so neatly by a man she did not trust. That is not a broken heart. That is an opening balance. She found the dowager in the card room and said she had a headache. She gave up her domino at the cloakroom and did not reclaim the ticket. She was in Grosvenor Street by midnight and at her writing desk by 10 past, still in her ball gown, and she wrote for 2 hours, everything in order, with the hour beside each item in the marbled book, in her small exact hand, the way her father had taught her to record a cargo before the memory of it could soften. At the bottom she wrote a sentence that was not a figure, the only one of its kind in 9 years of that book. "He does not know what I am. That is the last advantage I have, and I will not spend it on one evening's satisfaction." Behind her, in a house on Half Moon Street, her husband was telling his mistress that the grey woman had been an odd creature, and that he could not think who she was. And Sabine Varel, who was cleverer than he was and paying more attention, said, whoever she was, she had the coldest hands I ever saw take a glass. She was awake at 6. She wrote 3 letters before the fires were lit. The first went by the morning mail to Bristol, to the manager of the strong room at Fenner's, instructing him that the Marchmont sapphire and the 2 pearl pieces deposited in her name were to be removed from the general family box and held in a separate box under her sole signature. No other order to be honoured. By 9 o'clock the following morning her mother's ring was in a steel box in Bristol that no living man could open, and it stayed there, and Mrs. Sabine Varel never touched it. Not at Easter. Not ever. That is the first thing I want you to notice about Eleanor. Bitterness is a small satisfaction that costs you the asset. She simply moved it to a place where he could not reach it, and told no one, and let him find out at Easter when he asked and the bank said no. The second letter went to Mr. Ambrose Hale, the Ashcombe estate solicitor at Norwich, a dry, elderly, deeply unimaginative man whose only vice was an inability to leave an irregularity alone. It requested, in the politest possible terms, office copies of every lease, surrender, and deed touching the Ashcombe fenlands executed in the preceding 30 months, together with a note of who had instructed him in each. The third went to Mr. Pell at Fenners, who by then was a chief clerk with grey in his whiskers and a long memory of an £11 error courteously reported. It asked whether it was usual for a draft to be endorsed twice before presentation, and if he might, as a favour to an old client, keep private duplicates of any Ashcombe drafts crossing his counter, since her Grace was preparing a statement of the estate's affairs for the trustees of her settlement. Every one of those letters was in itself an ordinary piece of business. That was the design. She was not building a case, yet she was building the paper that a case is made of, and there is a difference. And the difference is that ordinary paper does not frighten anybody. Then she went down to Ashcombe, and in the 10 weeks that followed she did 4 things. She wrote down everything she had heard at the Masquerade, again from memory, and dated and signed each page, and had the pages witnessed at the bottom by Mrs. Dunning without telling her what they contained. A memorandum made at the time, signed and witnessed, is not gossip. It is evidence, and Hale would say so later in a courtroom to 12 men from Norfolk. She began keeping the estate accounts twice, once in the book Kemble saw, and once in the marbled book he did not, so that at any moment she could lay 2 versions of the same year side by side and let the gap speak. She stopped entirely asking her husband anything. He noticed this and was pleased by it. He told Sabine that the country had improved her, and she went to look at the fen. That was where she met Adam Rook. He was standing in 8 inches of water in the middle of what should have been the Mile End catchwater drain, in a coat that had given up, with a levelling staff under his arm and his boots ruined. And when the Duchess of Ashcombe came along the bank in her plain brown pelisse with a notebook in her hand, he did not bow, because he did not know who she was. And he said, "You are standing on my sightline, madam." She stepped back. She looked at where he was pointing, and she said, "The fall is wrong." He straightened up very slowly, the way a man does when the world has just produced something unexpected. "Say that again. The fall is wrong. The new cut runs the water from the Mile End level uphill for 3 furlongs and back into the old barrier bank. It cannot drain. In February it will hold water on 200 acres of the best silt in the county, which is precisely what it did before the cut was made, except that now there is a bill for it. Adam Rook, land agent and drainage engineer, 36 years old, sunburnt on the back of the neck, looked at this small brown-clad woman on the bank of his ditch and said, "Who taught you levels?" "Nobody. I taught myself out of a book, because we had a broken sluice and 11 years of promises." "Then you had better come and look at the sluice," he said, "because I have been standing here since Tuesday trying to work out why a man would build a drain that does not drain, and I am beginning to think he built it on purpose." They spent 4 hours on the fen that day. She got mud to her knees. He did not once ask her name because he was talking, and she did not once offer it, because for the second time in her life she had discovered the pleasure of being nobody, and this time it came with someone who listened to her. By the time she told him who she was, 3 weeks later, at the mill at Hollow Cross. They had already agreed on the design of a new sluice, a rate of pay for the diggers, and a great deal about the moral character of the Duke's man of business. He took the news of her rank badly for about 90 seconds, went slightly red, said, "You let me lecture you about compaction for an hour," and then, being a sensible man, went back to lecturing her about compaction. That is the entire romance at that stage. Two people in a wet field agreeing about a ditch. I want you to notice that the first man in 9 years to treat Eleanor Marchmont as a colleague did it before he knew she outranked him. Meanwhile, the allies came in, one document at a time. Hale sent the office copies in May with a covering letter that was 3 lines of business and 1 line of unease. I should observe that in 4 of these transactions I was instructed not by His Grace, but by Mr. Kemble under the power of attorney, and that the counterpart leases were executed elsewhere and returned to me for filing only. This is irregular. Mrs. Dunning came to the morning room in June, unlocked a drawer in the still room she had kept locked for 2 years, and put on the table a bundle of 9 letters addressed to the Duke at Ashcombe, unopened, and a small book in which she had recorded, in a housekeeper's careful, semi-literate hand, the date each had come and the date Mr. Kemble had told her to burn them. She had not burned them. "I am not paid to burn other people's letters, Your Grace," she said, "and it seemed to me a person might want them one day." 7 of the 9 were from tenants at Mile End, 2 were from a bank in Lynn. Pell's duplicates came in July in a plain parcel, 14 drafts drawn on the Ashcombe estate account, endorsed first by Silas Kemble and second, in a looping confident hand, by S. Verrell. Eleanor laid that parcel on her desk and sat looking at it for a long time in the last of the light, because it had just stopped being a story about a husband and a mistress. A mistress receives gifts. A mistress does not co-endorse 14 bank drafts with the estate's man of business. And in September, the Dowager came. Augusta arrived in her own carriage without warning, sat down, refused tea, and said, "My son has asked me to advance him £11,000 against the Wiltshire farms, which he does not own, and which I know he does not own, because my husband sold them in 1806. Somebody has told him he owns them. Eleanor, I have been unkind to you for 4 years and useful to you for 5, and I should like to know what is happening in this family." Eleanor considered for perhaps 3 seconds. Then she opened the bottom drawer, took out the marbled book, and laid it on the table between them. "Sit down," said the Dowager Duchess of Ashcombe, in the voice of a woman who has just decided which side she is on for the rest of her life, "and begin at the beginning. I have all day, and I have never liked Mr. Kemble. What the 2 duchesses assembled that autumn, with Hale's copies and Pell's duplicates, and Mrs. Dunning's unopened letters spread across a table in a cold room in a 106-room house, was not an affair. It was a machine. Silas Kemble had not begun with the Duke. He had begun with Sabine Verrell in Bath 4 years earlier, where the 2 of them had run a smaller version of the same arrangement on a widowed baronet, and had been paid off rather than prosecuted because the baronet's family preferred silence. Kemble found the marks. Sabine kept them entertained. The recommendation that had brought Kemble to Ashcombe as the Duke's man of business had come, through 2 intermediaries, from a friend of hers. The card party in the spring had not been chance. Sabine had gone to it knowing exactly who would be there. The machine worked like this. Kemble held the power of attorney, so Kemble could grant leases. He granted them at low rents to men who did not exist, or existed only as names on a paper. 3 of the Mile End farms were let to a Mr. Ambrose Sayer of Visbeck, a person nobody at Visbeck had ever met, and the same lands were then underlet at proper rents to the real farmers who had always worked them. The difference, some £900 a year, went to Mr. Sayer, who was Silas Kemble, and was paid out by drafts endorsed to S. Farrell, the rents she had raised. The fen she had drained. The improvement was the crop they were harvesting. The £4,000 deed of the 2nd of March, boasted about at a punch table to a woman in a moth mask, turned out to be a charge on the timber at Ashcombe Great Wood, granted by the Duke, drawn by Kemble, and assigned within a fortnight to a Bath moneylender who was Sabine Varell's late husband's cousin. The Duke had signed it believing he was borrowing against his own trees for his own amusements. He was, in fact, being farmed. Her husband was not the author of this. Her husband was too lazy to be the author of anything. He was vain, he was cold, he was contemptuous, and he had done all of that while being systematically emptied by the 2 people he trusted most. He was not the spider, he was the 2nd largest fly. It did not make her forgive him, it made her precise. There are different punishments for different crimes, and a woman who muddles them ends up with none of them. Through all of it, the other half of her life went on, and it went on, getting better. The new sluice at Mile End was finished that October, and the fen went into the winter dry for the first time in a century. Rook stayed on, at her invitation and quietly on her own money, because the estate's money was not safe. She reopened the little mill there, put in a 2nd pair of stones, and made a contract to grind for the Lynn corn factors. And by the following spring the mill was employing 9 men and returning better than 11%, and every penny of it ran through an account at Fenner's in her own name under her settlement, where the Duke's power of attorney did not reach and never had. She was happy. I want to say that plainly because these stories often forget it. In the middle of the worst year of her life, standing in a mill in a shawl with flour on her sleeve, arguing about millstone dress with a man in a ruined coat, Eleanor Marchmont was happier than she had been at any point since her wedding. Rook was by then a difficulty she had decided not to examine. He came to dinner at the mill house. He never once called her Your Grace when there was nobody there to hear it. In November he mentioned, in passing, in the middle of a discussion about drain tiles, that his father had died and that he would have to go north for a fortnight to deal with what he called family nonsense, and she noticed that his boots, when he came back, were still terrible, and his coat was still worse, and she thought no more about it for 4 months. Then, in the January, the machine reached for everything. It reached because Kemble had begun to feel the floor move. The Mile End tenants had stopped paying their under rents to Mr. Sayer and had started paying at the Duchess's door, because the Duchess had mended their roofs. Hale had asked one question too many about counterparts, and the Duke, who owed the Bath money-lender rather more than he could count, had been told by Sabine, in the sweetest possible way, that a man who cannot pay is a man who bores her. So they went for the £80,000. On the 11th of January a document was presented at Fenner's Bank in Bristol, a deed of release and reassignment of the Marchmont marriage settlement by which Eleanor, Duchess of Ashcombe, released the whole of her separate capital to her husband absolutely, in consideration of natural love and affection. It was drawn in Kemble's beautiful clerkly hand. It bore her signature, It bore 2 witnesses, one of them a groom at Grosvenor Street who could not write his own name, and it was dated the 2nd of December, on which day she had been at Hollowcross Mill in front of 9 men. Her signature was a forgery. A good one. He had had 9 years of household orders to practise from. Pell saw it come across the counter, and Pell did not raise the alarm, because Pell had had a letter from Her Grace in July, which had said, among other courteous things, that if anything irregular were ever presented in her name, he was to do 3 things and no others: take a fair copy, note the hour, and send word to Mr. Hale at Norwich. Now here is the moment where most people would have moved, and here is why Eleanor did not. She could have stopped it. 1 letter to the bank on the 11th of January and the deed dies on the counter. Kemble is dismissed, the Duke is embarrassed, and a soft, clever man walks out of Norfolk with £900 a year in his pocket to do it all again to some other woman in some other county. An attempted forgery withdrawn is a misunderstanding. A completed forgery uttered at a bank for value in front of witnesses, with the true signature and the true whereabouts of the signer provable on the day, is a felony. So she let them sign it. She let it be presented. She let Kemble come down to Ashcombe in February wearing the expression of a man who has won. And she let him lay a second document on her desk in front of her husband, and she let her husband say the words that he would remember on his deathbed. It is only a formality, Eleanor. The money is doing nothing where it is. Sign it and be a good girl. She looked at the paper. She looked at her husband. And she said, of course, send it to my solicitor, and I will sign whatever he advises. Kemble's face did something small and interesting. Your solicitor, said the Duke, puzzled. Hale acts for the estate. Mr. Hale acts for the estate, she agreed. Mr. Hale is not my solicitor. I have had my own since March out of my own money, as my settlement entitles me. Did nobody tell you? There was a silence in that room that she had waited 11 months to hear. Then she rang the bell and asked for tea, and inquired whether his Grace had slept well. Silas Kemble was tried at the Lent Assizes at Norwich on the 22nd of March, on 3 counts of forgery and 1 of uttering a forged instrument, and the trial took a day and a half. Mr. Hale opened the papers 1 at a time, and the effect on the courtroom was the effect of a man laying stones on a table. The office copies, with the instructions in Kemble's hand. The counterpart leases to a Mr. Ambrose Sayer of Vispesh, who was proved not to exist by the parish clerk of Vispesh, who had come 60 miles to say so and enjoyed it. The 14 drafts, endorsed twice. The deed of release, dated the 2nd of December, and against it the Millday book from Hollowcross for the 2nd of December, signed at the foot by the Duchess of Ashcombe, and by 9 men who had seen her there, 4 of whom were sworn, and gave their evidence in the flat voices of people who have decided that the truth is the least they owe her. And then the clerk called the last witness for the prosecution on the drainage and the value of the lands, and Eleanor, sitting beside the dowager with her hands in her lap, heard him say, Adam Rook, Viscount Carrow. She did not move. She was very good at not moving. He went into the box in the same terrible coat. He had been Viscount Carrow since November, heir to the Earl of Stainmore, which is the family nonsense he had gone north to deal with, and he had been born to it all along, and had spent 11 years in wet fields learning the only trade he respected. Because, as he told the court in 1 sentence when a barrister was foolish enough to ask, A man ought to be able to do something, my lord, and I could not sing. He gave his evidence and stepped down and did not look at her, which she was grateful for because she was not sure what her face was doing. The jury were out for 19 minutes. Kemble was convicted on all 4 counts and transported for 14 years, and he went out of that courtroom soft and deferential to the last, still calling the judge my lord with an extra syllable of respect. Mrs. Sabine Varel was not in the dock. She was named in it 11 times, which for a woman in her profession is worse. Her endorsements were read aloud. Her Bath history was read aloud. 2 of her own letters to Kemble were read aloud, including the one that ended the whole matter for her in the eyes of London society, in which she had written of the Duke of Ashcombe, "Keep him solvent a little longer, and stupid as long as you can manage." She was gone from Half Moon Street inside a week. The lease was in his name and the rent was not paid. She went to Boulogne, where she was owed money by nobody and owed it to several, and she is last recorded 3 years later at a boarding house in Dieppe, still handsome, still amusing, dining at other people's expense, and no longer laughed with. She had wanted him for having, not for keeping. In the end she had neither, which is what that arithmetic always comes to. The Duke of Ashcombe was not prosecuted. There was nothing to prosecute him for. Being emptied is not a crime. He came to Ashcombe in April, and he found his wife at the desk in the morning room with a file in front of her, and a solicitor sitting quietly by the window, and his mother in the chair by the fire. And he understood, with the slowness of a man to whom nothing has ever been explained twice, that this was not a conversation. It was a settlement being read to him. She did not raise her voice. She went through it item by item, each blow laid down like a stone. The 900 a year taken out of the fen. The timber charge. The 11,000 he had tried to borrow against land his father sold in 1806. The Gerard silver, recovered from Half Moon Street by Mr. Hale under threat of an action in trover. The 9 letters from his own tenants that he had never read because he had never been told they came. Then the terms. A deed of separation, drawn and ready. She would take the Norfolk fenlands and the mill at Hollow Cross under her settlement absolutely, in satisfaction of the sums abstracted from her. He would keep Ashcombe, the house, the name, and the debts, and he would keep them under the supervision of trustees appointed by his mother. Because he had proved beyond argument that he could not be trusted with a signature, he would not oppose the suit. If he opposed it, every document read at the Norwich Assizes would be read again in the ecclesiastical court, and this time his own conduct, not Kemble's, would be the subject. "And what am I to say," he said at last, "when they ask me what happened?" "Say what is true," Eleanor said. "It will be a novelty." He signed. He was in the end exactly what he had always been, a man who let things happen. But he did one thing that year that was his own, and I will give it to him, because the record should be complete. In the June, at the Norwich sessions, before the magistrates and the county and every family that had ever dined at his table, he stood up when the fen tenant's compensation was heard and said, without an excuse anywhere in it, that the frauds committed on the Ashcombe estate had been possible only because its owner had never once looked at his own accounts, that his wife had drained the fen he had let flood, mended the roofs he had let rot, and been robbed to pay for his pleasures, and that the disgrace was his and not hers, and he asked the court to record it. Then he went home to 106 rooms and shut most of them. He kept up the tenants' payments for the rest of his life out of an income that no longer stretched to a box at the opera. His mother said of it, with the terrible fairness of the very old, it is the one useful thing left in his power. And he does it. That is not redemption. It is merely a man being finally of some use. And in the March of the following year, the Marchioness of Ilbury gave her masquerade again. 200 people came, in dominoes and half-masks and one Cleopatra with an enamel asp, and at 11 o'clock the doors opened, and the Duchess of Ashcombe walked in wearing grey silk, her mother's sapphire on her hand, and no mask at all. She was the only unmasked face in the room. That is the image the papers used, and it was worth every word. Her husband was by the second window, near the hyacinths. He had come because he did not know what else to do with an evening. She crossed to him and stopped an arm's length away, exactly where she had stood the year before, and she spoke quietly, and the people nearest went silent. And then the people beyond them, and the silence went out across that room in a ring. She has a face like a Sunday afternoon, Eleanor said. She counts the candles. She suspects nothing, she forgives everything, and she has nowhere else to be. She is not kept. She is simply parked. The Duke of Ashcombe stood absolutely still. You said all of that at this window, on the 11th of March last year, to Mrs. Varell. Then you told a stranger in a grey mask the name of your man of business, the date of your deed, the sum of it, and that you meant to take my mother's ring off my hand at Easter. She let him look at the sapphire. She did not raise it, or point at it, or do anything with it at all. I was the woman in the grey mask, Julian. I stood here and heard every word, and I did not lift it, because you were still talking, and everything you said that night is now in the assize record at Norwich. Somebody near the card-room door said, out loud, "Good God," and that is the sentence that went round London for a month. I have no revenge to take on you, she said. You have been taken already by people who thought exactly as little of you as you thought of me. I only wanted you to know who was standing beside you. Good evening. And she walked away through a room that parted for her, and she did not look back, and she never spoke to him again. She married Adam Rook 14 months later in the small church at Hollow Cross on a wet Tuesday, in front of the millmen and the fen tenants and the Dowager Duchess of Ashcombe, who wept and denied it. He was by then the Earl of Stainmore, which nobody at the wedding mentioned because he had asked them not to. They had 2 daughters and a son. They drained 1,100 further acres between them and quarrelled about compaction for 31 years. Ashcombe Fen still runs dry in February. The mill at Hollow Cross ground corn until 1911. And in the bottom drawer of her writing desk, beneath the marbled book she never threw away, Eleanor kept one thing she had bought for herself and never worn again. A grey silk mask, moth wings swept back, silver thread along the edges. Her youngest daughter found it when she was 9 and asked what it was for. That, her mother said, is what I was wearing on the night I found out exactly what I was worth to a man who had never once looked at me properly. He thought a woman nobody looks at is a woman who cannot see. She folded it back into the drawer. Your worth is not in being chosen, my love. It never was. It is in what you know, what you keep, and what you build when they have all stopped watching you.